And I want to just start by what caused us to pursue this study, and it's precisely what Yehuda said during his opening remarks, which is we found during the 2013-14 negotiations that security was the toughest issues. That Israelis will never agree on a two-state solution unless their security needs are met. But Palestinians will never agree to a two-state solution if it includes a security system that they view as a permanent occupation or a violation of their sovereignty. So the challenge is how to balance these two very difficult questions. And interesting, when you talk to a lot of the previous negotiators, especially those in 2000 at Camp David and also at Annapolis, security didn't used to be the toughest issue. People used to just assume that one will work itself out, the experts will get together, and they'll make this happen. The bigger challenges were, as Yehuda said, Jerusalem, refugees. But that changed. I think that's changed a lot because of the experiences in Gaza, the experiences in the pullback in southern Lebanon. The Second Intifada has really changed, I think, the perspective of Israeli society and made this the central question. The other thing I'll say about why we did the report and what we think about with this report. Importantly, we refer to this report as the title is Advancing the Dialogue, a Security System for the Two-State Solution. And we talk about advancing the dialogue because before I describe some of the key elements, we don't view this as done. We don't think, here's a report, here's a set of ideas, we're finished. We view it as a living document. We want to go back and forth with people. We are open to changes, and these are just a set of ideas that are meant to hopefully spur continued discussion on this very difficult topic. And so the question becomes, why do this now? Why put this plan out now? And obviously the situation is very difficult between Israelis and Palestinians. And there doesn't seem to be much hope at the moment that we're on the verge of an agreement on a two-state solution. And so we thought of really three central reasons why we did this. The first, as somebody who worked on a previous round of the negotiations, the first thing we did and the first thing I did when I started my job on that process was to go back and look at everything that had been done on the outside between 2000 and 2013. And when you talk to negotiators, again, from Camp David, they will tell you that the political situation was much easier in 2000, and there was much more hope and space, but at least the American negotiators had a lot less of a sense of what the final status outcome solutions actually look like. And all this work that was done between 2000 and 2013 really put a lot of meat on the bones, really made it a lot more substantive. And nobody had done something like this on security, so we think this is something that will be very useful for future negotiators. It's also critical because if you know where you are going, it can help guide what you're doing today. And so painting this final picture of what a security arrangements could look like in the long term allows you to then say, today, here are things that we can do to make the situation better, even if we don't think a two-state solution is possible. And the big project that INSS is working on interim arrangements, that's a different security environment, but there's no question a lot of overlap, and there's no question that you can draw on some of the ideas in here, and they become consistent, almost part of a broader spectrum. So that, I think, is also essential. And finally, we wanted to try to send a message to people and try to demonstrate through very serious professional security study that this is doable, this is possible. This isn't, security should not be the reason why you cannot pursue an agreement with the Palestinians. There are all kinds of other challenges why right now might not be the right time or it might not work, but security and security arrangements are not the thing that stands in the absolute way of Israel and the Palestinians coming to some kind of an agreement that brings about a two-state solution. I'll also say, just in terms of background, that we spent a lot of time, in addition to consulting with a lot of Israeli security professionals on this, also talking to Palestinians, also talking to Jordanians, getting others' perspectives on this. And we do believe this is the type of document that, if you were to hand this to the Palestinians tomorrow and say, here it is, the answer would be no. But if you were to hand it to the Palestinians and say, here it is, and on borders, we'll be talking about 67 with swaps of equal size, then it's a negotiation. This has always been one of the formulas, security for borders. This is the security piece that inevitably leans towards Palestinians. So I'll just talk a couple minutes about some of the key principles that are in our report, and then I think Kris and Gadi can get into a lot more detail
Security leans towards Israelis.
Security leans towards Israelis. Yes, is that right? Did I say security leans towards Palestinians? No. Security leans towards Israelis. Borders leans towards Palestinians. But So in terms of, I'd say, a few of the key principles that we have in the report, and that really are the basis for the security system. First, almost all of our thinking is informed by the experience of the last few years, and especially the experience in Gaza and how you do things differently than Gaza, and how you don't end up with a repeat of Gaza, and you don't end up with Hamas controlling the West Bank, which is the number one concern that you get in the Israeli redeployment. And so the first element of that is what we call a multi-layered security system. So Israel would have multiple layers of security as part of the system. The first would be going externally, would be in the event of an agreement, stronger security cooperation and relations with Jordan, with Egypt, with Saudi Arabia, with the rest of the Arab world, which become almost an external defense for Israel beyond even its own borders. The second would be a much better border security system than the one that exists today on the Jordan River, and also security measures to deal with the border between the future state of Palestine and Israel. That again, especially that system on the Jordan River, we believe would be much better than the one that exists today, with significant upgrades that would make it stronger. A third layer of the system would be effective counterterrorism inside the Palestinian Authority, inside the new Palestinian state. And there, a long process that would, over a number of years, train Palestinian security forces, continue to increase their capacity. And then beyond that, a critical layer, a final layer, would be Israel's ability to defend itself by itself in the case of an emergency. Now, Palestinians will never agree to that, but Israel can take unilateral steps, as it does in Syria, as it does in Lebanon, as the United States does when it needs to. And you can even have some quiet arrangements between the United States and Israel on American diplomatic support in those kinds of scenarios. It can't be something that happens every day, or the entire agreement will fall apart. And the whole point of all the layers is to make sure that it's something that doesn't happen very often. But it still is that final layer of security. Second key principle that we have in the report is early, easy, visible steps by Israel very quickly to make it clear to the Palestinians that this is ending, that Israeli forces aren't going to be there forever, that Israel is serious about a two-state agreement. And this matters a lot for the Palestinians, because there's a lot of things that can be done to reduce Israeli visibility very quickly to Palestinian civilians. And the trade-off is, for those types of steps, which is whether it's specifically at the border crossings, or whether it's moving out of certain large chunks of Area C that are not security problems, that will buy you more time and space for the much more difficult sacrifices that need to be made, the Palestinians will need to make, and the longer process that will need to be taken for the really difficult security challenges that Israel faces, and where Israel does need that a lot more time and reassurance. So the trade-off is things you can do immediately to signal to the Palestinians versus Palestinian patience on the more difficult questions that take longer. Finally, the third key principle, and I'll stop after this, is what we call a conditions-based criteria-dependent withdrawal. Basically, we're talking about Israel will not leave the West Bank unless it believes the security situation is such that it can do it. Palestinians insist on a timeline and timetables. So how do you reconcile those? And we have a process that Kris can get into more details on, which basically says you have target timetables, Israel only redeploys, and the IDF only redeploys if conditions that are based on that timetable and if very specific criteria agreed to by security professionals are met. And there's a process for how you measure and judge, which Israel is involved in, and Israel has, to some extent, the veto in a first round of such a process. There's a remediation process, and then an opportunity, again, to try to come to agreement on meeting these different criteria. But the key is, Palestinians can see that there's a clear plan and clear pathway with targeted timetables, while Israelis know that they will not be leaving the West Bank unless their security concerns are absolutely met. So, in sum, what we're trying to do is say, and this is again going back to that question of Gaza, which is the biggest question that people constantly raise. When Israel left Gaza, it had one insurance policy. That insurance policy was, we can go back in. Not a very good insurance policy, and as it turns out, not one Israel is keen to support. And what we are arguing is, if Israel redeploys from the West Bank, then you can have 6 insurance policies. Stronger relations with the Arab world, better border security, a counterterrorism system internally, a slow conditions-based redeployment, where you'd have actually, I should say, external monitors, including the United States, watching this process and executing on this process and supporting and advising and training Palestinian security forces. And at the end of all that, you still have Israel's ability to take unilateral action when it needs to. And that is, in our view, a much more effective system and a much better way to ensure that Gaza, that the West Bank never becomes Gaza, even if you have Israeli deployment. So I'll stop there and maybe hand it over.
Ilan, thank you very much, Ilan. And now we'll go over to General Shamni, who has a lot of experience.
We'll do Kris.
What's it called? So we'll change the thing.
We changed the order on
So
this.
we'll change the order, no problem. As long as you're all going to speak, doesn't make a difference to the order. לא שומעים אותם שמה? Can you speak from here, from the podium? They think it may be easier? Okay, so our next speaker is Colonel Bauman, who, as I mentioned before, worked at Lieutenant General Allen, who I think is the American officer more than anyone else who has really had experience in this issue. The floor is yours. Okay,
Thank you, sir.
It's 10 minutes, okay?
Absolutely. Thank you for having us here, Amos. Thank you so much. We really appreciate that. It's a pleasure to be at the other INSS. I work at the other INSS in Washington, D.C. It's confusing. We get each other's email, but it's all good. I want to talk about 2 components of it. There's not time, obviously, to go into 65 pages of detail, but these 2 pieces are really critical, and then a little bit on the American involvement in that. The first piece I want to talk about is the core group that makes this entire thing happen, and that's a Security Implementation and Verification Group, so an SIVG. And that sits at the core of this whole process and manages the entire thing. It would be headed by an American 3-star general, similar to the U.S. security coordinator today, but a much bigger organization. It would have an Israeli 2-star deputy and a Palestinian 2-star equivalent deputy. And those 3 flag officers would manage the entire process. Underneath the SIVG, you would have several sections. So you would have a planning section that oversees the entire process. And the planning section would develop, this report is really the overview. The planning section would develop a probably multi-100-page document that outlines how you would execute this transition over time. And it's important to understand that we're talking about a 10 to 15-year process for this entire thing to take place. And as the criteria are met, you would move one small geographical area at a time, very slowly, very deliberately, very carefully over time to make sure all the conditions are correct. Key to the process is that all 3 parties, the U.S., the Palestinians, and the Israelis, agree at the beginning to very specific, very objective criteria that the Palestinians have to meet by their performance before anything moves forward. And if you can imagine multiple lines of effort, training of the Palestinians, the building of infrastructure along the border, building of operation centers, etc., and these lining up across time, that when you hit a certain milestone that crosses several lines of effort so that you know that their performance is up to speed in a particular area by the objective criteria, you know the infrastructure is in place for that particular area, then you're ready to transfer authority from Israeli security forces to Palestinian security forces in that area only, and the IDF redeploys from just that one spot. The entire time, American monitors are involved. So as they're executing the plan, they're training, and then they're being evaluated by 3 evaluators, an American, an Israeli, and a Palestinian. So all 3 evaluators are involved in every evaluation. And as long as all 3 evaluators agree that the criteria is being met, the plan continues to move forward. If there's disagreement, if any of the parties says, you know what, they don't meet the criteria, then it immediately goes into a remediation. And the planning section creates a remediation plan for that particular area and executes that training plan, and they meet a second evaluation. And then all 3 evaluators look and see if they've met the criteria. And it bumps up through from the lieutenant colonel level to the colonel level up to the flag officer level as these remediations occur. And if they still can't agree at the 3- and 2-star level whether they've met the criteria or not, if there's still disagreement, then it would have to bump outside to a political envoy kind of a level. The reason that's important is because now you've separated security issues from political issues. And the whole point of having this SIVG is to keep the conversation and the process professional, separated from the politics. And that's what this thing accomplishes. The second piece I want to talk about very briefly is the counterterrorism system, because this is critical to the exact question of how do we keep the West Bank from becoming Gaza. And that question, how do you keep the West Bank from becoming Gaza, was in our mind from the beginning. The entire thing is structured on that premise. So the counterterrorism system works this way. It's set aside from the entire Palestinian legal system as it stands right now. You would have separate counterterrorism forces that are Palestinian, separate prosecutors, separate judges, and separate detention officers that are set aside in what we would call a counterterrorism tunnel. They're vetted to know who they are and what their influences are, and they're protected from having malign influence from the outside. We built this kind of system successfully in Iraq and in Afghanistan, where the judges and the detention officers were set aside, and then you don't have the revolving door out the back. If they arrest somebody, they run right out the back. So the counterterrorism forces would be trained up to the level of a SWAT unit in a big city like Los Angeles or New York. They go onto a target, they make the high-risk arrest, they bring them back into the separate detention system. They're prosecuted by these separate prosecutors and judged by these separate judges, and then put into a separate detention system, because it's going to be decades and decades and decades for the Palestinian legal system to reform, and we understand that. This speeds that up. At the same time, if Israelis have intelligence that they don't want to share with the Palestinians, and we understand that, there's an American in this intelligence fusion cell that can look at it and go, you know what, you need to move on this target. And if the Palestinians hesitate at all, then the Israeli counterterrorism forces are prepared and planned and ready to move in on the same target. That's how we see that working. Third thing and last, I just want to throw this out. I know that when we talk about U.S. forces training security forces, everyone thinks of Iraq and thinks of what happened with ISIS. And I just want to give you a little bit of insight on that I think might be helpful for this conversation. I was in Iraq in 2011. It was one of the more surreal experiences of my life to watch on CNN on a TV screen live pictures of troops crossing through the southern Iraq border into Kuwait. And the news announcers were saying, you know, the last American forces have now departed Iraq. It was surreal because I was watching it from Baghdad. So that was a little strange, but what we saw occur immediately thereafter was that Prime Minister Maliki began to take out the professional generals and replace them with political hacks. And we watched them, the quality of the forces in the field begin to deteriorate. 3 years after that, we saw what happened. The generals not only were not in the field, they weren't supplying their troops, they weren't paying their troops, they weren't even getting food to their troops. So the troops are standing on the front line watching the ISIS hordes come across. They have no support, they have no ammunition, their training is out of date, and of course they ran. The key lesson from that is that if you're going to do this kind of business, you keep your hand on the forces. And that's why a huge part of this plan is American forces watching over this. 300 to 800 trainers and monitors that make sure that there's no retrograde in the performance of the Palestinians. That's critical to it. And I know the question comes up a lot about, well, what about if there's something, an event occurs and it harms the relationship or puts in danger the relationship between the United States and Israel? I can tell you as an American serving in the American military that our commitment to this place, to this cause, is higher than any other around the world. And we've served in a lot of bizarre places, a lot of places we care about a lot less than here. And the American people are committed to that. We've had initial meetings with the American Congress. They feel the same way. So I think that relationship would not at all be in danger.